On Vladimir Putin's orders, North Korean soldiers are storming Ukrainian positions. Meanwhile, Georgian politicians supported by Moscow have taken over the country. Ukraine and Georgia are now facing Russian imperialism, and their fate is increasingly uncertain. To talk about all these issues, we're joined by Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Good evening, and thank you for joining me tonight.
Good evening.
So let's start with Georgia. How determined are Georgians to keep the protests going, and will they actually have the power to change the situation?
Well, what we can see from the protests is that they're continuing and that the people who participate are determined. But the question is what impact that will have. Those in charge can decide to ignore it. And clearly the presidential election or the outcome will be carried out as planned, regardless of these protests. I think what we are seeing is a split in Ukrainian society, both between ordinary Georgian society, between ordinary Georgians and then at the same time Georgians and the ruling party, and it's unclear how the protesters, how they can achieve what they want to achieve, even though we in the West consider it laudable and indeed the only path forward for Georgia.
So there's been major protests over the past few weeks. We have our very own Don Arleth from TVP World on the ground reporting more on the situation. How do you see the situation in Georgia evolving? What are the possible scenarios which could potentially take place in days and weeks to come and Georgia's near future?
See, this is why this is so similar or reminiscent of Ukraine 10 years ago. In fact, it's so reminiscent that I happened to say Ukraine earlier when I meant Georgia. So it is really a fork in the road for Georgia. Do they want to pursue a pro-Western path or a pro-Russian path? And we saw what happened in Ukraine. And I worry that Georgia will face an equally tumultuous future, because there is very little compromise. Either your direction as a country is to become pursue a path of more alignment with the European Union, or your path is to pursue more alignment with Russia. You can't do both at the same time, and that's why this is such a decisive time for Georgia, and then also, frankly, tragic time, because what looks likely to happen is that the pro-Russian side, through various means, will be able to steer Georgia in that direction. That will be to the detriment of large parts of Georgian society, and I think also the stability of Europe. Now, we should remember that Russia and the pro-Russian side in Georgia will see it differently, but from a European perspective, from an EU perspective, it is tragic that what seems to be happening is that Georgia is, through various means, sliding more in a pro-Russian direction.
It is definitely a tragic development to be watching what's happening in Georgia as of now. But what could the European Union actually do in order to help people in Georgia and to possibly have some influence on the situation in the country?
Well, let me start with what the European Union should not do, and that is to tell the Georgian government or Georgian society what to do. Even though we feel we rightly feel that we have useful suggestions and advice for Georgia, any sort of involvement and engagement of that kind would be construed by Moscow and indeed by the pro-Russian side of Georgian politics as EU meddling in Georgian affairs.
So let me rephrase this. So what could Europe actually do to help Georgians?
Yes, that is a much harder question. It's much easier to say what the European Union should not do. I think what the EU can do is keep insisting on the importance of free and fair elections, of free speech, open debate, and so forth. These are values that nobody can contest. Not even the Kremlin can dispute that free and fair elections are a good thing. Then it's clear that Russian elections are not free and fair. But that's the sort of thing the European Union can do, and not just the European Commission, not just members of the European Parliament, representatives from all over the European Union, including Poland, and I think voices from Poland and other countries that are closer geographically to Georgia would count even more than, let's say, voices from France or Germany. That is an important thing, and showing solidarity with ordinary Georgians.
Let's now move to Ukraine. So we're moving from Georgia to Ukraine. We are on day 1026 of the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion. The situation on the Eastern Front, as we reported before, is very difficult. What do you think are the biggest challenges that Kyiv is facing as of now?
The election of Donald Trump, or rather the inauguration of Donald Trump, for sure. And it's just such a fundamental question mark for Ukraine. What will happen once Trump takes charge? And it matters not just because his policy as of now is extremely hard to read, but especially because, as we all know, the United States is Ukraine's most important ally and supporter and donor in this war. And that's why it has been fascinating and frankly baffling and frustrating to try to figure out what the Trump administration's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine will be, because there seems to be a divide between different camps in the incoming Trump administration, and Donald Trump himself seems to sort of veer from one position to the other from one day to the next. So it's extremely hard to know, just as you know, from an analytical perspective. And imagine then being the Ukrainian government trying to figure out how to continue fighting this war without knowing whether and how your most important ally will support you.
Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, but I have one short question I wanted to ask you. We have heard about the Northern Korean troops joining Russian troops to fight in Ukraine. What would you say, North Korean troops joining Russia, a sign of power of Russia or a sign of weakness?
It's definitely a sign of weakness. Russia would not be using North Korean troops if it had enough troops itself. And yes, these North Koreans may make a difference for the Russians and may achieve some minor breakthroughs on behalf of Russia. But we should remember that North Korea is not doing this as an act of kindness. North Korea, Kim himself.
There is always business involved. We always need to remember there is always business involved.
There is always business involved, and North Korea will extract a price for this.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And so this would be all the latest news here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned here on TVP as we'll be back in just a moment.